But I go, can I just try another one? That moment comes and I just go, this is Sparta!
He stood on a cliff's edge, armor catching the light, and screamed 3 words that would echo through pop culture for 2 decades. This is Sparta wasn't just a line, it was a launch pad. But what audiences cheering in theaters back in 2007 never knew was that the man delivering that roar was, in his own words, barely holding his body together. Years later, Gerard Butler has opened up about what actually happened on the set of 300, and the story is far darker, far stranger, and far more painful than anything that made it to the screen. This is the version of 300 you were never shown. Nobody in Hollywood expected 300 to work. When it hit theaters in March 2007, it had no A-list marquee names, no conventional historical drama structure, and a visual approach so stylized that early industry chatter treated it as a gamble at best. Director Zack Snyder took Frank Miller's graphic novel and translated it almost panel for panel onto film, leaning into slow-motion carnage, oversaturated color, and a comic book texture that hadn't really been attempted at that scale before. The gamble paid off in a way nobody saw coming. On a production budget of roughly $60 million, the film opened to a staggering $70 million in its first weekend alone. By the time its theatrical run wound down, 300 had pulled in more than $450 million worldwide, turning a stylized, R-rated war epic into one of the most profitable films of the year. Analysts and entertainment outlets pointed to it as proof that audiences were hungry for something visually daring, something that broke from the safe, formulaic historical epics that had come before it. The ripple effects went far beyond box office charts. The Spartan physiques on display, chiseled, lean, and seemingly carved from marble, sparked a fitness obsession that spilled out of movie theaters and into gyms across the world. Personal trainers and fitness magazines scrambled to package the workout the cast had supposedly used to get in shape, and suddenly getting a 300 body became a phrase people searched for constantly. Gyms began running Spartan-themed classes. The film wasn't just entertainment anymore. It had become a cultural reference point for physical transformation. But behind that triumphant narrative was a production that pushed its cast to genuinely dangerous extremes. And for years, fans only saw the polished final cut. It took Gerard Butler speaking candidly, long after the film's release, for the real picture to come into focus. According to Butler, the day-to-day reality of filming 300 looked nothing like the mythic glory audiences saw on screen. In interviews given years after production wrapped, he's described the set as a place where injuries weren't the exception, they were routine. He's recalled turning around mid-fight sequence to see a castmate down after a prop spear came close to striking an eye, or another performer collapsing after a fall that ended in a broken ankle. By his own account, hospital trips became almost a daily occurrence. Part of what made the production so physically brutal was the choice to keep much of the choreography as authentic as possible. Rather than leaning heavily on stunt doubles, many of the principal actors were pushed to execute their own fight sequences, take after take, while wearing heavy custom armor and moving through a confined studio space wrapped in blue screen on every side. The visual payoff was worth it cinematically. Audiences got performances that felt visceral and real, but the human cost behind the camera was steep. Bruises, torn muscles, and cuts became part of the daily routine rather than rare mishaps. There was also a strange psychological demand layered on top of the physical one. Because the vast majority of the battle environments were built digitally in post-production, the actors spent long stretches of the shoot swinging swords at empty air, reacting to enemies that existed only in their imagination and in Snyder's storyboards. That meant every convincing grimace, every flinch, every triumphant shout had to be manufactured purely through acting instinct, with no practical effects to react to. Combine that mental strain with physical exhaustion, heavy gear, and repeated stunt work, and it's easy to understand why Butler has described finishing each day of filming completely spent, both in body and mind. For Butler specifically, playing a king who leads his men into a battle he knows they cannot survive meant treating the physical suffering almost as part of the performance itself. He has suggested that the pain wasn't something to be avoided, it became fuel. Still, what looked like invincible heroism in the finished film was, behind the scenes, the product of a shoot that bordered on reckless. Long before cameras rolled, The transformation into a Spartan warrior had already begun, and it started in a gym, not a costume fitting. Roughly 7 months out from filming, Butler and his fellow cast members entered a training program built specifically for the film, working with a specialized strength and conditioning approach that had nothing to do with a typical Hollywood get toned for the role regimen. Sessions reportedly stretched up to 6 hours in a single day, blending powerlifting-style strength work, functional conditioning, sword fighting choreography, and grueling circuit training designed to build both size and battlefield endurance. The philosophy behind the program wasn't about looking impressive in still photos. It was about creating actors who could move convincingly like soldiers, carrying weapons and heavy gear through extended physical sequences without their form breaking down. The training methodology leaned heavily into functional, high-intensity conditioning, tire flips, kettlebell work, sprint intervals, obstacle course-style circuits, and endless repetitions of pull-ups and push-ups. Martial arts drills were repeated relentlessly until the movements became instinctive rather than memorized, blending choreography with something closer to genuine combat readiness. The goal, as Butler has described it, was never simply aesthetic. It was about becoming in mindset and physical capability, something closer to the warriors the script demanded. That intensity came at a real cost. Butler has spoken about how close the training came to breaking his body rather than building it. He's referenced developing tendinitis, hip issues, and a torn rotator cuff during the process. Injuries severe enough that there were stretches when lifting his arms overhead was genuinely difficult. And the physical demands didn't stop once filming began. Long days on set were often followed by additional training sessions to maintain the physique needed for continuity between scenes, creating a cycle where recovery time was minimal and the exhaustion simply compounded. Butler has been blunt in later interviews, describing the process as one that was, in essence, wearing his body down rather than sculpting it. Yet he's also framed that suffering as central to the performance. The idea that genuinely feeling depleted and pushed past his limits helped him access the mindset of a leader asking his soldiers to do the same. The 8-week condensed version of this program eventually leaked into public fitness culture and became something of a legend on its own, with everyday gym-goers attempting it and more often than not, failing to complete it. What set Butler's approach apart, according to those who worked closely with him, wasn't only the physical commitment. It was how far he took the psychological immersion into Leonidas. He's talked about using meditation as a way to mentally step outside himself and into the mindset of a king preparing to lead hundreds of men toward near-certain death. For Butler, treating the role as something to merely perform on camera wasn't enough. He wanted to actually inhabit the emotional weight of that decision. That same all-in mentality extended to his insistence on doing as much of his own stunt work as possible. Rather than stepping aside for a double during the film's most physically demanding sequences, Butler frequently chose to throw himself into the choreography personally, believing the authenticity of a performer actually executing the movement translated directly onto screen. He's described certain battle sequences as producing some of the most intense adrenaline surges of his career, precisely because there was no separation between the actor and the physical stakes of the scene. This willingness to court real risk in service of realism wasn't limited to 300. In the years following the film, Butler found himself in several situations where the line between performance and genuine danger blurred. He's spoken about suffering hypothermia during a separate shoot in Iceland, and about a harrowing car stunt sequence gone wrong during production on another project. Taken together, these episodes paint a picture of an actor who has repeatedly prioritized physical authenticity over personal safety across his career, with 300 representing an early and formative example of that pattern. Adding to the challenge on 300 specifically was the almost complete absence of practical blood or gore effects. Nearly everything violent in the finished film was layered in digitally during post-production, meaning the cast had virtually nothing physical to react to in the moment. There were no squibs, no elaborate prosthetic wounds, no visual cues signaling the brutality that would eventually appear on screen. Actors had to conjure the horror of battle purely through imagination and instinct while standing in front of blank blue screens, a demand that required a different kind of concentration than a traditional practical effects-heavy production. Snyder's ambition for 300 was to recreate Frank Miller's graphic novel almost frame by frame, and achieving that meant abandoning traditional filmmaking methods almost entirely. Rather than constructing elaborate physical sets or filming on location, the production shot nearly the entire film inside a single studio space in Montreal, with the overwhelming majority of shots relying on visual effects layered in afterward. Cliffs, throne rooms, oceans, and battlefields all existed only as digital environments built around the actors after the fact. That approach gave Snyder extraordinary creative control over lighting, atmosphere, and color grading, allowing him to craft the film's now iconic painterly aesthetic. But it also meant the cast spent months performing in a cramped, blue-screen-wrapped soundstage under harsh artificial lighting designed to produce the film's signature high-contrast look. Those lights generated intense heat, and combined with heavy armor and grueling physical choreography, conditions on set became genuinely punishing. Butler has said the toll of those conditions caught up with him directly, recalling an incident where dehydration and overexertion caused him to pass out during filming. Long hours under scorching studio lights, compounded by the physical demands of repeated fight sequences in full costume, pushed the cast toward their physical limits in ways that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with basic environmental strain. Even some of the film's more surreal creative choices grew out of this improvisational pressure cooker environment. The Oracle's eerie, disjointed dialogue, for example, wasn't scripted in the traditional sense. Much of it emerged from loose, in-the-moment improvisation designed to heighten the character's otherworldly quality. Snyder wasn't chasing historical accuracy with these choices. He was chasing myth, atmosphere, and symbolism, even if that meant leaning on unconventional, semi-improvised performances to get there. The visual style birthed by all of this eventually rippled outward into film and television for years afterward, with later productions borrowing 300 slow-motion combat, stylized bloodshed, and dramatic color grading as a kind of visual shorthand for epic, mythic storytelling. Amid all the injuries, exhaustion, and grueling training, something unplanned took root among the cast. A genuine sense of brotherhood that Butler has credited as essential to making the film's central themes land emotionally. Leading an ensemble that included Lena Headey, David Wenham, Dominic West, and a then-rising Michael Fassbender, Butler has spoken about how the shared physical suffering of training and filming forged bonds that went far beyond a typical professional cast dynamic. Long before cameras started rolling, the cast trained together, sweated together, and pushed through identical grueling routines day after day. That shared hardship, according to Butler, built something closer to real trust than anything a rehearsal schedule alone could produce. He's described feeling like the cast had, in some sense, already been through a version of war together by the time principal photography began. An unspoken understanding of each other's limits, pain points, and breaking points that translated directly into how convincingly they performed as a unified fighting force on screen. That camaraderie extended well past the workout sessions. The cast leaned on one another to get through the heat, the isolation of performing for months against blank blue screens, and the psychological wear of endless retakes without the usual comfort of built environments or practical scenery. For actors like Headey and Wenham, whose characters carried some of the film's quieter emotional beats, that underlying trust among the group gave scenes of loss and sacrifice a weight that went beyond scripted dialogue. Fassbender, still early in his career at the time, has credited the ensemble's collective focus with helping him stay grounded through such a demanding shoot. What emerged from all of that shared suffering wasn't just a functional working relationship. It became the emotional backbone the film needed to sell its central idea of soldiers bound together by loyalty unto death. Few involved in 300's production could have predicted the scale of its lasting cultural footprint. What started as a stylized adaptation of a graphic novel grew into a reference point that shaped filmmaking, fitness culture, and internet humor for years afterward. Its aggressive use of high-contrast color grading, digitally enhanced slow motion, and dramatic lighting effectively became a visual template that other productions would borrow from repeatedly, with later shows and films echoing its dramatic flair in their own action sequences. The fitness impact proved just as significant. the now legendary workout associated with the cast transformation, built around brutal, high-repetition circuits with virtually no rest between movements, was adopted, adapted, and repackaged by gyms and trainers around the world almost immediately after the film's release. Fitness publications ran their own breakdowns of the routine, and the idea of chasing a Spartan physique became a genuine cultural touchstone, sparking broader conversations about body image, discipline, and the sometimes unhealthy extremes tied to that pursuit. Beyond fitness, the film's themes of loyalty, sacrifice, and defiance against overwhelming odds struck a chord that reached well past typical action movie audiences. Its most iconic line transcended the film entirely, becoming a meme template and cultural shorthand used across countless unrelated contexts online, cementing 300's place in internet culture long after its theatrical run ended. There was even an unexpected academic ripple effect. Renewed public interest in the historical Battle of Thermopylae led to a noticeable uptick in engagement with ancient historical texts covering the event, and some educators began using the film as a jumping-off point for classroom discussions about the gap between historical fact and cinematic myth-making. Historians were often quick to criticize the film's liberties with accuracy, but many also acknowledged its unusual power to spark curiosity about the ancient world among audiences who might never otherwise have engaged with it. Within the industry itself, 300 proved something Hollywood executives hadn't fully believed going in: that a film built almost entirely inside a blue-screen soundstage, without major box office stars carrying the marquee, could still become a massive financial success. That validation opened doors for Zack Snyder to take on larger studio projects in the years that followed, while simultaneously launching Gerard Butler from a relatively under-the-radar actor into a recognizable leading man practically overnight. Before 300, Butler's resume was solid, but unremarkable by blockbuster standards, supporting turns and mid-tier leads in projects that showcased his range without ever quite breaking him into the mainstream. His performance as the Phantom in a 2004 musical adaptation, along with roles in a handful of period and adventure films, had proven he had range and screen presence, but none of it had translated into the kind of visibility that changes a career trajectory. King Leonidas changed that instantly. Butler's commanding, physically imposing performance turned him into an overnight action star, and the film's cultural saturation meant audiences who had never seen his earlier work suddenly knew exactly who he was. Casting directors took notice of his ability to combine raw physical intensity with genuine emotional depth, and offers for both action-heavy and more sensitive dramatic roles started coming in quickly. He used that momentum deliberately, avoiding being boxed in as purely an action performer. A romantic drama opposite Hilary Swank the same year 300 released showed a softer, more vulnerable side of his acting range, helping broaden how studios and audiences saw him. He followed that with a run of genre-hopping projects: a crime drama helmed by a prominent British director, a dark revenge thriller that highlighted his ability to carry morally complicated characters, and a string of commercially successful romantic comedies opposite major leading ladies that kept him firmly in the mainstream conversation. Even as he diversified, Butler kept returning to the kind of grounded, physically demanding action roles that had first made him a star, eventually anchoring a long-running action franchise built around a hardened Secret Service agent character across multiple sequels. He also continued to seek out smaller, more character-driven projects in between the bigger studio efforts, signaling that he wasn't interested in coasting purely on the Leonidas persona, even as it remained the role most fans would always associate him with first. Looking back now, it's clear that 300 didn't just launch Butler's career. It fundamentally shaped the type of actor he became. It gave him a global audience, an iconic signature role, and enough industry credibility to spend the next 2 decades moving between blockbuster spectacle and more intimate storytelling. For millions of fans, he will always be the fearless king who roared into legend on a Spartan cliffside. But as Butler himself has made clear in revisiting those grueling months of filming, that legendary performance was built on a foundation of real pain, real risk, and a level of commitment that fans watching in theaters back in